The gavel cracked like a whip across the humid Georgia air, sharp and final, silencing the low murmur of the crowd gathered in the dusty Savannah auction yard. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, glinted off the sweat-slicked faces of men in worn hats and rough-spun coats, their eyes fixed not on the auctioneer's flailing arms, but on the wooden block where she stood. Alara, barefoot, barely clothed in a thin, threadbare shift that clung to her slight frame, stretched taut over the undeniable swell of her belly. Her dark eyes, wide with a terror that had long since burned past tears, scanned the sea of indifferent faces, searching for a flicker of mercy, a shred of humanity. She found none. Only the hungry, calculating stares of buyers assessing damaged goods. The auctioneer's voice, slick with practiced indifference, cut through the thick silence. "Gentlemen, behold, prime field hand, Alara, strong back, young limbs," though, he paused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp that somehow carried to every ear. "Carries a bit of baggage. Master's own get, they say. Makes her tricky. Who'll start the bidding? $10? 5. A nervous titter rippled through the crowd. $5 for a prime young woman? Preposterous. But the baggage, that changed everything. $2. Silence. $1. Still nothing. The auctioneer sighed dramatically, feigning exasperation. "All right then, for the lot, the woman and the consequence. I'll take 12 cents. 12 cents for the pair. Going once, going twice." Alara's breath hitched, a strangled sound lost in the oppressive heat. 12 cents. Less than the price of a sack of corn. Less than a cheap bottle of whiskey. Her life, her child's future, reduced to pocket change because the man who owned her body had also stolen her innocence and left her with this impossible, damning proof. As the gavel slammed down for the third and final time, "Sold to the gentleman in the back for 12 cents. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, seeped into Alara's bones. The man striding forward, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose. He wasn't looking at her with the leering greed of the others, nor the dismissive contempt. His gaze was fixed solely on her swollen abdomen, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a storm. And in that moment, Alara knew with chilling certainty. Her nightmare wasn't ending with this auction. It was only just beginning. Alara's world had once been the sprawling, oppressive expanse of Magnolia Grove Plantation. Owned by the formidable and ruthlessly efficient Silas Thorne, Magnolia Grove was known for its pristine white columns, its meticulously tended cotton fields that stretched to the horizon like a sea of green and white, and its iron-fisted discipline. Alara, orphaned young and sold to Thorne as a child, knew no other life. She'd learned early that survival meant silence, obedience, and making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Her days began before dawn, her hands raw from picking cotton under the blistering sun, her back aching from bending over endless rows. Nights were spent in the cramped, drafty slave quarters, listening to the muffled sobs of others, the distant crack of a whip, the ever-present fear that coiled in her gut like a cold serpent. Silas Thorne was a man carved from granite and cruelty. He ruled Magnolia Grove with a ledger in one hand and a riding crop in the other. Profit was his god, and human suffering was merely a line item to be minimized, not eliminated. He saw his slaves not as people, but as assets, breeding stock, field hands, house servants, each with a calculated value. Alara, with her quiet strength and nimble fingers, had been assigned to the big house a few years back, a coveted position that meant slightly better food, marginally less backbreaking labor, but infinitely more danger. The big house was where the master's eyes lingered, where his whims held absolute power. It started subtly, a hand lingering too long on her shoulder as she served his coffee, a command to stay behind after the other house servants had retired, ostensibly to polish silver, but really just to stand in the dimly lit parlor while he drank his brandy, his gaze crawling over her. Alara learned to move like a ghost, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, keeping her eyes downcast, her voice a whisper. She perfected the art of being present yet invisible. But invisibility was a fragile shield against a man like Silas Thorne. The night it happened, the air was thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and impending storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that mirrored the dread coiling in Alara's stomach. She'd been sent to his study to fetch a ledger he'd forgotten. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows. Thorne was slumped in his leather chair, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't heard her enter. "Alara," he'd rasped, his voice thick with drink and something else, a raw, predatory hunger that froze her blood. "Come here." She'd stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Why yes, Masa? Don't play coy with me, girl," he'd snarled, pushing himself unsteadily to his feet. "I've watched you, moving about like a little mouse. Thinking I don't see you? Thinking you're too good." He took a lurching step towards her. The smell of whiskey and sweat was overpowering. "You belong to me, every part of you." Alara tried to back away, but her legs felt like lead. "Please, Masa. I just came for the ledger. The ledger can wait," he'd growled, closing the distance in 2 strides. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. His other hand fumbled with the buttons of his trousers. "You've been asking for this. With those eyes, that little body." His words were slurred, nonsensical, but the intent was terrifyingly clear. What followed was a blur of terror, pain, and suffocating darkness. The rough wood of the desk against her back, the crushing weight of him, the desperate, silent scream trapped in her throat, choked by fear and the knowledge that resistance meant death, or worse, being sold downriver to the sugar mills, a fate whispered about in hushed, horrified tones. She'd closed her eyes, retreating deep inside herself, a place where the violation couldn't touch her soul. When it was over, he'd shoved her away with a grunt of disgust, as if discarding a used rag. "Get out!" he'd spat, turning back to his brandy, already dismissing her. "And if you breathe a word of this, you know what happens." Alara had stumbled back to the quarters, trembling violently, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. She'd scrubbed herself raw in the cold water trough until her skin was raw and bleeding, but the stain felt permanent, etched into her very being. She told no one, not Old Man Joe, the kindly but broken field hand who sometimes shared his meager rations. Not her friend Bessie, whose sharp eyes missed little. The shame was a heavy stone in her chest, and the fear of Thorne's retribution was a constant, gnawing presence. She prayed it was a one-time horror, a drunken aberration. But weeks passed, and the familiar monthly cramps didn't come. Instead, a strange nausea took hold, a fatigue that went beyond the bone-deep weariness of plantation life. A terrifying suspicion began to take root, growing alongside the subtle changes in her body. The slight rounding of her belly beneath her shift, the tender swell of her breasts. She tried to hide it, binding her middle with strips of cloth, eating less to avoid drawing attention, but the truth was relentless. One morning, while scrubbing laundry in the scalding water, a wave of dizziness overtook her, and she collapsed. She woke in the dim infirmary, a drafty outbuilding smelling of herbs and despair. Mammy Ruth, the elderly woman who served as the plantation's unofficial healer and midwife, knelt beside her, her face etched with lines of sorrow and understanding. She didn't need to ask. Her weathered hand gently rested on Alara's still flat stomach. "Child," Mammy Ruth whispered, her voice thick with tears Alara couldn't shed, "you carry in Massa's seed." The words were a death sentence. Alara felt the world tilt. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. "No, Mammy, please, it can't be." "It is, Chili," Mammy Ruth said softly, squeezing her hand. "The signs don't lie, and Massa, he'll know soon enough. He watches everything." The implications crashed over Alara like a tidal wave. A child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved. But a child fathered by the master? That was a different kind of poison, created a living, breathing complication. A constant, visible reminder of the master's transgression. An heir that could never be acknowledged, yet could never be ignored. Such children were often treated with particular cruelty by the master's wife, or sold away at the first opportunity to erase the evidence, or, in the worst cases, disposed of entirely. Elara's hand flew protectively to her stomach. This tiny life, conceived in violence, was already marked for suffering. She lived the next months in a state of suspended terror. Every glance from Thorn felt loaded. Every time his wife, the brittle and vindictive Eleanor Thorn, swept through the house with her hawk-like eyes, Elara felt exposed, vulnerable. She saw the way Eleanor's gaze would linger on her middle, a flicker of suspicion hardening into cold fury. Whispers started among the other slaves are not malicious, but fearful. They knew what this meant. They knew the danger Elara and her unborn child were in. Thorn himself became distant, avoiding her, his usual commands delivered through overseers. But Elara felt his presence like a shadow, a constant pressure. Then, one sweltering afternoon, the summons came. Not to the big house, but to the overseer's office. A small, windowless room that reeked of sweat, tobacco, and fear. Thorn stood by the door, his back to her, staring out at the fields. He didn't turn as she entered, trembling. "So," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's true." Elara dropped to her knees, her head bowed. "Masa, I didn't." "Silence!" he roared, whirling around. His face was a mask of cold fury. But beneath it, Elara saw something else, panic. Shame. "You carry my child? My bastard." He spat the word like poison. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've risked?" "Masa, please," Elara sobbed, tears finally breaking free. "I didn't want this. I never." "Your wants mean nothing," he thundered, pacing like a caged animal. "Eleanor suspects. She's watching, asking questions. This thing growing inside you is a threat. To my name, to my marriage, to everything I've built." He stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that awful night. Calculating, assessing, like she was a piece of faulty machinery. "You're damaged goods now, Elara. Worthless. Worse than worthless. You're a liability." The words cut deeper than any whip. Worthless. Because of his act. Because of the life he had forced into her. What will you do, Masa?" she whispered, the question barely audible. Thorn's jaw tightened. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. He flipped through pages filled with neat columns of numbers, names, ages, prices. He found her entry. Elara, age 19, field/house. Value, $800. He took a pen, dipped it in ink, and with a single brutal stroke, drew a thick line through her name. Then, below it, he wrote a new entry, his handwriting sharp and decisive. Elara, pregnant, master's issue. Value, $0. He slammed the ledger shut. "You're going to the auction block tomorrow," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "First thing, I'll be rid of you and your problem before Eleanor can make a scene. Consider yourself lucky I don't just have you drowned in the river." Lucky. The word echoed in Elara's mind as she was roughly escorted back to the quarters. Lucky to be sold for nothing. Lucky to be cast out like garbage. Lucky to carry the child of the man who destroyed her into an unknown, terrifying future. That night, curled on her thin pallet, one hand protectively cradling her belly, Elara wept silent, bitter tears. She wasn't just losing her home, her meager security. She was losing any hope of a future for herself or the tiny life within her. All because she was a vessel for her master's sin. The auction block. The words alone sent a fresh wave of nausea through Elara as she stood there, exposed under the brutal Georgia sun. The rough wood beneath her bare feet felt like the deck of a ship about to sink. The crowd was a blur of faces, hard, curious, indifferent. She focused on a single point in the distance, a gnarled oak tree on the edge of the yard, trying to anchor herself, to escape the reality of her situation. She felt the weight of their stares, the way their eyes dissected her, lingering on the curve of her stomach with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. She heard the whispers, sharp as shards of glass. Thorne's leavings, that one. Carrying his brat, they say. 12 cents? He practically gave her away. Who'd be fool enough to take on that trouble? Probably just wants the child for breeding later. Or to drown it quiet like. Each word was a fresh wound. She kept her eyes down, her hands clasped tightly over her belly, as if she could shield the child from the ugliness of the world already pressing in. The auctioneer's spiel was a dull roar in her ears, punctuated by the sickeningly low bids. $10. 5. 2. 1. The humiliation was absolute. She was worth less than a sack of feed corn, less than a broken plow. Her value, in the eyes of this world, was defined solely by the unwanted life she carried, a life that was her master's shame, her own burden, and now, apparently, a liability worth 12 cents. Then came the gavel. Crack. Sold. For 12 cents. The finality of it stole her breath. She forced herself to look towards the buyer, the man who had just purchased her life and her child's for pocket change. He stood slightly apart from the main crowd, near the back of the yard, leaning against the fence post. He wore simple, sturdy clothes, rough trousers, a faded shirt, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't tall, but there was a solidity to him, a quiet strength in his posture that was different from the swaggering arrogance of the other buyers. He didn't leer. He didn't gloat. As the auctioneer called out his purchase, he pushed off the fence and started walking towards the block, his steps deliberate, unhurried. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Who was he? A poor farmer looking for cheap labor? A speculator hoping to resell her later, child or no child? Or something worse? The rumors about men who bought pregnant slaves for other purposes slithered through her mind, making her skin crawl. She braced herself for his touch, for the rough grip that would signify her transfer of ownership. He stopped a few feet from the block. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and pushed his hat back from his forehead. Alara gasped. His face was lean, weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, not cruelty. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startlingly clear gray, like storm clouds over the sea, and they held an intensity that was almost frightening. But within that intensity, Alara saw something she hadn't expected. Not lust, not greed, not even pity. She saw recognition and a deep, simmering anger. His gaze wasn't on her face or her body. It was fixed, unwavering, on her swollen abdomen. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He didn't speak to her. Not yet. He turned to the auctioneer, who was holding out a grubby piece of paper, the bill of sale. The man took it, his movements economical, and pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp against the late afternoon sky. The anger she'd seen in his eyes at the auction was still there, banked but present, like embers in a dying fire. He sensed her look and turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. His gray gaze held hers for a long moment, searching, assessing. Then he spoke, his voice low, barely above a whisper, as if afraid someone might overhear. "They told me you were sold," he said. 12 cents. He spat the words like they were bitter. "For carrying his child." Alara flinched. "Why, yes, sir." "Don't call me sir," he said abruptly, his voice rough. "My name is Jonah." "Jonah?" she repeated softly, testing the name. It felt strange on her tongue, belonging to a free man, a man who owned her now, yet spoke to her without the usual condescension. He was silent for another long stretch of road. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the fields they passed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice even lower, almost a growl. "That child, its thorns?" Alara nodded, a single, jerky movement. Tears pricked her eyes again, but she blinked them back fiercely. She wouldn't cry in front of him. Not yet. Jonah let out a slow, controlled breath. He didn't look at her, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the reins. "I know what he did to you," he said, the words heavy with a rage that vibrated in the air between them. "I know." Alara's breath caught. How could this stranger know? The shame burned hot in her cheeks. I don't understand." "You don't need to understand yet," Jonah said, his voice softening slightly, though the anger remained. "Just know this, you're safe now. As safe as I can make you. And that child." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "That child is mine to protect. Not his. Never his." The words were a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. Safe. Protect. Words she hadn't dared hope to hear, but they were also terrifying. What did he mean? Why would he care? What did he want from her? From the child? The mystery deepened, wrapping around her like the gathering dusk. She was no longer Thorne's property, sold for 12 cents. She belonged to Jonah now, and his reasons for buying her, for that fierce, protective declaration about her unborn child, remained a dangerous, compelling enigma. The wagon rolled on, carrying her away from the known horror of Magnolia Grove and into the unknown shadow of Jonah's intentions. The suspense wasn't over. It had merely changed shape, becoming sharper, more personal, and infinitely more complex. The journey to Jonah's place was long and silent. The only sounds the creak of the wagon, the plod of the mule's hooves, and the sighing of the wind through the pines. Alara sat rigidly on the rough bench, every muscle tense, her mind racing. Safe? The word echoed, but it felt fragile, conditional. Jonah's declaration about the child being his to protect was both a comfort and a source of profound unease. What claim could he possibly have? He wasn't the father. Thorne was. The biological truth was a cold, hard fact she couldn't escape. Yet, Jonah's conviction was absolute, his anger on her behalf palpable. It didn't make sense. She stole glances at him as they traveled. He sat straight-backed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his profile was tense, the line of his jaw set hard. He wasn't a large man, but there was a wiry strength in his frame, a sense of contained power. His clothes were worn but clean, patched with care, speaking of poverty but not destitution. He handled the reins with an easy competence, clearly a man used to hard work and solitude. The silence wasn't oppressive, exactly, but it was charged, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of the secret he seemed to carry. As dusk deepened into night, they turned off the main road onto a narrow, overgrown track. Trees closed in on either side, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and pine resin. After another hour of bumping along the rutted path, they emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin small, sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney puffing a thin wisp of smoke into the starry sky. A small garden plot was visible in the moonlight, neat rows of vegetables. A few chickens clucked softly in a coop nearby. It was humble, isolated, but undeniably a home. Jonah pulled the mule to a stop beside a lean-to shed. "We're here," he said, his voice breaking the long silence. He climbed down first, then turned and held out his hand to help her down. His touch was brief, efficient, but not unkind. He unhitched the mule and led it to a small paddock behind the cabin, where a trough of water and a pile of hay awaited. "Inside," he said, gesturing towards the cabin door. "It's not much, but it's dry." Alara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. A single oil lamp burned on a rough wooden table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The main room was sparsely furnished. The table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a small fire crackling in the hearth, and a narrow cot piled with blankets in one corner. The air was warm, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It was clean, orderly, and utterly devoid of any personal touches. No pictures, no trinkets, nothing that spoke of a life before this solitude. "Sit," Jonah said, pointing to one of the chairs. He moved to the fireplace, where a cast-iron pot hung over the flames. He lifted the lid, releasing a savory aroma of stew. "You must be hungry." Alara's stomach growled traitorously, despite her fear. She hadn't eaten since the meager gruel before the auction. She nodded mutely and sat, perching on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched him as he ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her, along with a chunk of coarse bread and a tin cup of water. "Eat," he said, placing the bowl before her. He didn't sit. He leaned against the mantelpiece, his arms crossed, watching her with that same intense, unreadable gaze. Alara picked up the spoon, her hand trembling slightly. The stew was simple: beans, potatoes, maybe some salt pork. But it smelled like heaven. She took a small bite, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. She ate slowly, carefully, acutely aware of his eyes on her. When she'd finished most of the bowl, Jonah pushed off the mantel. "There's a pallet in the back room," he said, nodding towards a door opposite the fireplace. "For you. It's warmer back there, away from the draft." He paused, his expression hardening slightly. "You'll sleep there. I'll take the cot out here." Alara's heart skipped a beat. The implication was clear. He wouldn't share the main room with her. He was giving her privacy, a space of her own. It was a small gesture, but in her world, where privacy was a luxury slaves rarely knew, it felt monumental. It spoke of a respect she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze flickering to her belly for a brief second before returning to her face. "Get some rest. You've had a long day." He turned and began stoking the fire, his back to her, effectively ending the conversation. Alara rose slowly, her body aching from the journey and the emotional turmoil. She carried her empty bowl to the table and then walked towards the back room. The door opened to a small, windowless space, barely large enough for the narrow pallet piled with clean, if rough, blankets. It was indeed warmer, the heat from the main room's fireplace seeping through the log walls. She sank onto the pallet, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. The events of the day, the auction, the journey, Jonah's cryptic words, swirled in her mind, a chaotic storm. But beneath the fear and confusion, a tiny, fragile ember of hope flickered. Safe. He'd said she was safe, and he'd given her this room. Maybe, just maybe, he meant it. Sleep came fitfully. She woke several times in the night, disoriented, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. Once, she heard Jonah moving quietly in the main room, adding wood to the fire. Another time, she thought she heard a low, anguished sound, quickly stifled. She lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness outside, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and the steady, quiet breathing from the other side of the thin wall. It was a different kind of fear, not the sharp terror of Magnolia Grove, but the anxious uncertainty of the unknown. Who was Jonah? Why had he bought her? What did he truly want? Days turned into a strange, suspended routine. Jonah was a man of few words and predictable habits. He rose before dawn, tended to the mule and the small garden, checked his few traps in the woods surrounding the cabin, and spent hours working on repairs or whittling small pieces of wood by the fire. He spoke to Alara only when necessary, offering meals, asking if she needed anything, instructing her on simple tasks like mending clothes or helping with the garden. His manner was never harsh, but it was distant, guarded. He maintained a careful space between them, always sleeping on the cot in the main room, never entering the back room unless she was out. Alara, for her part, moved cautiously, like a wild animal learning to trust. She accepted his provisions gratefully, worked diligently on the tasks he gave her, and kept her observations to herself. She watched him. She saw the calluses on his hands, the way he moved with economical grace, the deep lines of solitude etched around his eyes. She saw the way his gaze would sometimes drift to her belly, not with lechery, but with a profound, almost painful intensity. And she saw the moments when the mask slipped, when he thought she wasn't looking. A shadow of grief or fury would cross his face, so deep it seemed to hollow him out. One afternoon, While helping him weed the garden, Alara felt a sudden, sharp pain low in her back. She gasped, dropping the trowel, and clutched her side. Jonah was at her side instantly, his hand hovering near her elbow, not quite touching her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. It's nothing," Alara lied, trying to straighten up. "Just a cramp." But another wave of pain, sharper this time, made her double over. Jonah's hand finally settled on her arm, steadying her. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Is it the baby?" Alara nodded, tears of pain and frustration welling in her eyes. "It's too early. It's only been a few months." Panic seized her. Was she losing the child? Was this Thorn's final cruelty, reaching out from Magnolia Grove to destroy the last thing she had? Jonah's face went pale beneath its tan. Without another word, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, cradling her carefully against his chest, one arm supporting her back, the other under her knees, mindful of her stomach. He carried her swiftly back to the cabin and laid her gently on the cot in the main room, the one he usually slept on. He then disappeared into the back room and returned with a bundle of dried herbs. "Mammy Ruth taught me some remedies," he said, his voice rough as he quickly crushed the herbs in a mortar. "For when things go wrong." He mixed the crushed herbs with hot water from the kettle, creating a pungent-smelling tea. "Drink this, slowly." Alara sipped the bitter tea, her eyes never leaving his face. The concern in his eyes was raw, genuine. It wasn't the concern of an owner for valuable property. It was deeper, more personal. As the warmth of the tea spread through her and the cramping slowly began to ease, a question she'd been too afraid to ask finally forced its way out. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice trembling. Why did you buy me? For 12 cents? Why do you care about this child?" She gestured weakly to her belly. "It's his, Silas Thorne's. You know that." Jonah froze, the mortar and pestle in his hands. He didn't look at her for a long moment, his jaw working. The firelight flickered across his face, deepening the shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it, thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name: grief, rage, and something else, something like despair. "Because it's not just his," Jonah said, the words scraping out like stones. He finally met her eyes, his gray gaze burning into hers. "It's hers too." Alara frowned, confused. "Hers? Whose?" Jonah looked away, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. He walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames, his back to her. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Alara held her breath, sensing she was on the precipice of the truth, the secret that had hung between them since the auction block. "My sister," Jonah finally said, the words barely audible. He turned back to her, his face etched with a pain so profound it made Alara's own heart ache. Her name was Clara. She was sold to Silas Thorne 5 years ago. Alara's blood ran cold. She remembered Clara, a quiet girl with eyes like Jonah's, that same startling gray. She'd been brought to Magnolia Grove shortly before Alara was moved to the big house. She'd been assigned to the kitchen. Alara had seen her sometimes, always looking down, always moving quickly. Then one day she was just gone. Thorne had said she'd been sold downriver for insubordination. No one questioned it. No one dared. What happened to her?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jonah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Thorne, he took her. Like he took you. Repeatedly. She fought him at first. Tried to run. They caught her." His voice broke. He broke her. Broke her spirit. Broke her body. She got pregnant. His child. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "When the baby came, it was a boy. Stillborn," they said. "But Clara, she never recovered. She just faded away. Wasted to nothing. Died 3 months later. They buried her in the field, like an animal." A sob caught in Alara's throat. She remembered the quiet despair that had settled over Clara in her last months. the hollow look in her eyes. She'd been too scared, too focused on her own survival to reach out. Now, the pieces crashed together with horrifying clarity. Jonah hadn't just bought a pregnant slave. He'd bought a woman carrying the child of the man who had destroyed his sister. He saw Clara in Alara. He saw the same horror, the same violation. And he saw the child not just as Thorne's bastard, but as a potential heir to Clara's suffering, a living reminder of the monster who had killed his sister. That's why Alara breathed, understanding dawning with a terrible weight. You bought me to protect the child because of Clara? Jonah nodded, a single, sharp movement. I couldn't save her, he said, his voice thick with guilt and rage. I was just a boy then, working on a neighboring farm. By the time I heard, it was too late. But I swore I'd make Thorne pay. And I swore I'd protect anyone else he tried to destroy. He looked at her belly, his expression fierce. This child, it carries his blood, yes, but it also carries yours. And that makes it worth saving, worth fighting for. I won't let him touch it. I won't let him near you. Not ever again. Tears streamed freely down Alara's face now. Tears of shared grief, of unexpected solidarity. She wasn't just a vessel for Thorne's sin anymore. She was a link to Clara. She and her unborn child were part of Jonah's vow, his penance, his war. The isolation of the cabin suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. Jonah wasn't just her owner. He was her unlikely guardian, bound to her by a shared enemy and a shared tragedy. Thank you, Jonah, she whispered. The words filled with a depth of gratitude she couldn't fully express. For Clara. For me. He just nodded again, his jaw tight, the storm of emotion still raging in his eyes. But the distance between them had shifted. The guardedness was still there, born of years of pain and the constant threat of Thorne's reach. But it was now overlaid with a fragile, hard-won trust. They were no longer just buyer and bought. They were allies in a silent war against a common monster. And the child growing inside Alara was the fragile, precious prize they were both sworn to protect. The fragile piece of the cabin was shattered one sweltering afternoon 2 weeks later. Alara was sitting on the porch, mending a tear in Jonah's shirt, the late summer sun warm on her skin. Her belly was noticeably larger now, the life within her kicking with increasing strength, a constant, reassuring reminder of the future they were fighting for. Jonah was deep in the woods, checking his traps further out than usual. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the buzz of insects were suddenly cut short. An unnatural silence fell, heavy and ominous. Alara's head snapped up. Her heart began to pound. She strained her ears. Nothing, just the oppressive stillness. Then a sound, faint at first, then growing louder. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming fast down the overgrown track. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Thorne, it had to be. He'd found them. He'd come to reclaim his property, to erase the evidence of his crime once and for all. She scrambled to her feet, her hands flying to her stomach. She looked wildly around the clearing. No place to hide. The cabin offered little protection. She stumbled inside, her mind racing. Where was Jonah? He wouldn't be back for hours. The hoofbeats were loud now, right at the edge of the clearing. Alara peeked through a crack in the shuttered window. 3 riders. Not Thorne himself, but his overseer, Briggs, a hulking brute with a face like a smashed potato, and 2 of his most vicious henchmen, Hank and Jeb. They reined in their horses, their eyes scanning the cabin and the clearing with predatory intent. Briggs dismounted, his heavy boots thudding on the ground. He strode towards the cabin door, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Open up," he bellowed, his voice rough and commanding. "We know you're in there, girl. Master Thorne's property don't belong out here with some backwoods hermit." Alara pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was trapped. She glanced at the back door, but the riders were positioned to see anyone trying to flee. Her eyes darted to the fireplace. The poker. It was heavy, iron. A weapon. She crept towards it, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. Before she could reach it, the cabin door crashed open. Briggs filled the doorway, his beady eyes scanning the room. He spotted her instantly, cowering near the fireplace. A cruel smile spread across his face. "There you are, little rabbit. Thought you could hide." He took a step inside. "Master Thorn sends his regards. He wants his property back. And the package it's carrying." He lunged for her. Alara screamed and grabbed the poker, swinging it wildly. Connected with his arm with a sickening thud. Briggs roared in pain and anger, but it only seemed to enrage him further. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling to the floor, the poker clattering from her grasp. Stars exploded behind her eyes. She tasted blood. "Stupid wench," Briggs snarled, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her to her feet. "You think some hermit can protect you? He's probably miles away, and by the time he gets back, you'll be on your way back to Magnolia Grove where you belong." He dragged her towards the door, his grip brutal on her scalp. Just as they reached the threshold, a voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a razor. "Let her go, Briggs." Jonah stood at the edge of the clearing, not 10 yards away. He must have doubled back, sensing trouble. He held his hunting rifle, not pointed directly at Briggs, but leveled steadily, the barrel gleaming in the sunlight. His face was a mask of icy fury, his gray eyes fixed on the overseer with lethal intent. Briggs froze, his hand still tangled in Alara's hair. He let out a harsh laugh, but it lacked its usual confidence. Well, the hermit returns. Put that pea-shooter down, boy, before you get yourself killed. This is Thorn business. You got no claim here." "I bought her," Jonah said, his voice dangerously calm. "Fair and square. 12 cents. Bill of sales in my pocket. She's mine now, and you're trespassing." 12 cents. Briggs sneered. "For damaged goods? Thorn's got a writ. Says she's escaped property, carrying stolen goods, his heir. He wants her back. And the brat." He tightened his grip on Alara's hair, making her whimper. "Now, put the gun down, or I'll snap her neck right here." Jonah didn't flinch. His eyes never left Briggs's. "You lay another finger on her," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And I'll put a bullet between your eyes before you can blink. And your friends." He flicked his gaze towards Hank and Jeb, who were still mounted, hands hovering near their own weapons. "They'll be picking your brains off the dirt. Now, let her go." The tension was a physical thing, thick enough to choke on. The only sounds were the nervous stamping of the horses and Alara's ragged breathing. Briggs's eyes darted between Jonah's steady rifle and Alara's terrified face. He knew Jonah wasn't bluffing. The man had the look of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. With a final, vicious yank that made Alara cry out, Briggs shoved her away from him towards the cabin. "This ain't over, hermit," he spat, backing towards his horse. "Thorn won't forget this. He'll come for her himself if he has to, and he'll burn this shack to the ground with you in it." He scrambled onto his horse, his face purple with rage. "Mark my words." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it back down the track, his 2 henchmen following close behind, casting hateful glances back at Jonah. The sound of their retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Alara sank to her knees on the porch, trembling violently, tears streaming down her face. The pain in her scalp was nothing compared to the terror that had gripped her. Jonah was at her side in an instant, dropping his rifle and kneeling beside her. He didn't touch her, not yet, giving her space. "Alara?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Are you hurt? The baby?" She shook her head, unable to speak, just clutching her stomach. The baby kicked, a strong, reassuring thump against her palm. "Alive. Safe. For now." Jonah let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. He ran a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion and fury deepening. "They found us," he said, more to himself than to her. His gaze swept the clearing, the woods, his expression grim. "It's not safe here anymore. Not with Thorn knowing where we are." Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with fresh fear. Where will we go? Jonah's jaw tightened. He looked towards the north, where the land grew wilder, less settled. There's a place, he said slowly, deep in the mountains. A settlement of people who help folks like us. Folks running from men like Thorn. He met her eyes, his gray gaze filled with a desperate resolve. The Underground Railroad. We have to run, Alara. Tonight, before he sends more men. Before he comes himself. The Underground Railroad. The whispered legend. The network of secret routes and safe houses used by enslaved people seeking freedom in the north. Alara had heard stories, fragments of hope passed in hushed tones in the quarters. But it was always just a story, a dream for others. Not for her. Not with a child coming. The journey was said to be perilous, filled with slave catchers, treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of betrayal. But the baby, she whispered, her hand resting protectively on her belly. It's not due for months, but the journey. It's too dangerous to stay, Jonah said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Thorn won't stop. He'll send more men or come himself. He'll burn this place down. He'll kill us both to protect his name. He reached out then, his hand hovering near her arm, a gesture of reassurance. I'll get you there, Alara. I swear it. I'll carry you if I have to, but we have to leave. Now. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. Stay and face certain death, or flee into the unknown, risking everything for a chance at freedom, for herself and her child. She looked at Jonah, at the fierce determination in his eyes, the same determination that had driven him to buy her for 12 cents, to protect her for Clara's sake. He was her only hope. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the fear still there, but now mixed with a spark of desperate courage. She nodded. Okay, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. We go. Jonah's shoulders relaxed slightly, a fraction of the tension leaving him. Good. Pack what you can carry. Just the essentials. Food, water, warm clothes. We travel light and fast. He rose and went inside, moving with urgent efficiency, gathering supplies, dried meat, hardtack, a water skin, blankets, his rifle, and a small pouch of coins. Alara followed, her movements shaky but purposeful. She packed a few changes of clothes, the precious herbs Mammy Ruth had given her, and a small, smooth river stone Clara had once given her as a child, a tiny, secret token of the sister Jonah had lost. As night fell, cloaking the cabin in darkness, they stood ready. Jonah slung a pack over his shoulder, checked his rifle, and turned to Alara. He held out his hand, not to lead her, but to offer support. Ready. Alara looked back at the small cabin, the only place that had offered her a semblance of safety since Magnolia Grove. Then she looked at Jonah, at the fierce protector who had become her unlikely anchor. She placed her hand in his. Ready. They slipped into the woods, leaving the cabin and the fragile peace behind, stepping into the vast, dangerous unknown, guided only by the North Star and the desperate hope of freedom. The hunt was on, and Thorn's shadow stretched long behind them. The journey north was a gauntlet of fear, exhaustion, and fleeting moments of fragile hope. Jonah moved like a ghost through the night, his knowledge of the land their only shield. He avoided roads, sticking to dense thickets, dry creek beds, and the darkest shadows of the forest. Days were spent hidden in concealed hollows or dense thickets, sleeping in shifts, ears straining for the telltale sounds of pursuit, the baying of hounds, the distant shout of men. Alara's pregnancy became both a burden and a source of fierce determination. The extra weight slowed her down. The constant need to rest was a liability, and the fear of going into labor in the wilderness was a constant, gnawing dread. But the life within her, the tiny kicks and flutters, became her anchor. This child was worth every ache, every moment of terror. She thought of Clara, of Jonah's vow, and pushed herself beyond what she thought possible. Jonah was tireless. He scouted ahead, found hidden springs for water, set small snares for rabbits to supplement their meager rations. He carried the bulk of their supplies, insisting Alara conserve her strength. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant reassurance. At night, when they huddled under a shared blanket for warmth, he would sometimes point out constellations, his voice low and steady, a small attempt to soothe her frayed nerves. "See that bright one?" he'd murmur, pointing north. "Polaris, the North Star, our guide. As long as we keep it on our left, we're heading the right way." They encountered their first real test near the Savannah River. Slave patrols were thick here, watching the crossings. Jonah knew they couldn't risk the main ferries or bridges. He led them to a narrow, treacherous spot where the river churned over rocks. "We cross here," he said, his voice tight. "It's deep and fast, but less watched." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. The water looked cold and deadly. "Jonah, the baby. I'll carry you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He secured their packs high on his back, then turned to her. "Hold on tight. Don't let go, no matter what." He waded into the icy water, gasping at the shock. Alara wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her legs locked around his waist. The current tugged at them, strong and insistent. Jonah fought for footing on the slippery rocks, his muscles straining. Halfway across, his foot slipped. They both went under, swallowed by the freezing, churning water. Panic seized Alara. She kicked wildly, her lungs burning. Jonah's arms tightened around her like iron bands. He surged upwards, breaking the surface with a gasp, dragging her with him. He coughed, spitting out water, but his grip never loosened. "Hold on," he choked out, his voice raw. He found his footing again, stumbling forward with renewed desperation. Step by agonizing step, he fought the current, until finally, blessedly, his feet touched the muddy bank on the other side. He collapsed onto the shore, pulling Alara with him. They lay there, gasping, shivering violently, soaked to the skin. Alara's hands flew to her stomach, terrified. But after a moment, she felt it, a strong, insistent kick. Relief, so profound it made her dizzy, washed over her. The baby was okay. Jonah pushed himself up, his face pale but determined. "We can't stay here," he rasped, his teeth chattering. "We need to get warm, find shelter." He helped her up, his own body trembling with cold and exertion, but his focus entirely on her. They stumbled into the woods, finding a shallow cave beneath an overhang. Jonah quickly gathered dry tinder and managed to coax a small, smokeless fire to life. He wrapped Alara in dry blankets from their pack, rubbing her arms to restore circulation, his movements gentle despite his own shivering. As the warmth seeped back into her bones, Alara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and a dawning, deeper affection. He had risked his life, without hesitation, to get her across that river. For her, for the child. He wasn't just fulfilling a vow to Clara anymore. He was fighting for them. Days bled into weeks. They navigated dense forests, crossed muddy fields under cover of darkness, and once hid for an entire day in a cornfield as a patrol passed within yards of their hiding spot. Alara's belly grew heavier, her steps slower, but her resolve hardened. Jonah's vigilance never wavered. He was her shield, her guide, her silent partner in this desperate flight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The air grew cooler, the terrain steeper and more rugged. Jonah's pace slowed, his eyes scanning the landscape with renewed intensity. "We're close," he said one evening, his voice thick with exhaustion but also a flicker of hope. "The next station should be just over that ridge." They crested the ridge as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold. Below them, nestled in a hidden valley, was a small cluster of cabins. Smoke curled from chimneys. It looked peaceful, ordinary, but Alara knew better. This was a haven. Jonah led her down the slope, his steps quickening with urgency. As they approached the nearest cabin, a figure emerged from the doorway, an elderly black man with kind eyes and a face lined with wisdom. He took one look at Jonah, at Alara's pregnant state, and the exhaustion etched on both their faces and nodded slowly. "You made it," the old man said, his voice warm and gravelly. "Welcome to Freedom's Rest. I'm Ezekiel. Come in. You're safe now." The words "you're safe now" washed over Alara like a bomb. She stumbled forward, tears of relief streaming down her face. Jonah's shoulders slumped, the constant tension finally easing. They had made it. They had crossed into the network. They were one step closer to true freedom. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, warmth and the smell of baking bread enveloped them. Ezekiel's wife, a sturdy woman named Martha, fussed over Alara, bringing her hot tea and a bowl of stew, her hands gentle as she helped her sit. "You rest now, child," Martha murmured. "You've carried a heavy burden." And for the first time since the auction block, Alara allowed herself to believe it. Freedom wasn't just a word whispered in the dark. It was a place, a network of people like Ezekiel and Martha, willing to risk everything to help others escape the chains. And Jonah was her steadfast companion on this road. The 12 cents he'd paid for her felt like a lifetime ago, a cruel joke from a world they were leaving behind. Here, in this hidden valley, she wasn't property. She was Alara, and her child would be born free. The respite at Freedom's Rest was a balm, but it couldn't last forever. Thorn's shadow, though distant, still loomed. Ezekiel received word through the network, coded messages passed by trusted travelers, that Thorn had doubled his reward for Alara's return and was hiring ruthless bounty hunters, men known for their brutality and lack of scruples. The net was tightening. After 3 days of rest, good food, and Martha's gentle care, Jonah knew they had to move on. Alara, though still weary, felt stronger, the constant fear momentarily soothed by the kindness of their hosts. Her belly was large now, the baby active and strong, a constant reminder of why they couldn't stop. Ezekiel provided them with new supplies, sturdier boots for Alara, warmer clothes, more food, and a small map marked with the next safe house, deep in the Pennsylvania mountains. "Follow the ridge line," Ezekiel instructed Jonah, his finger tracing the map. "Avoid the valleys. The hunters will be watching the low ground. The next station is run by a Quaker family, the Millers. They're good people. Trust them." As they prepared to leave, Martha pressed a small bundle into Alara's hands. "For the baby," she whispered, her eyes kind. Inside was a tiny, hand-knitted blanket, soft and warm. Alara clutched it to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she breathed, "for everything." Jonah shook Ezekiel's hand, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, with a final nod of gratitude, they turned and walked back into the wilderness, the North Star their constant guide. The journey through Pennsylvania was even more perilous. The landscape was more settled, with farms and towns dotting the countryside. Slave catchers operated openly here, empowered by the Fugitive Slave Act, which required even free states to return escaped slaves to their owners. Every stranger on the road was a potential threat. Every farmhouse could hide a bounty hunter. Jonah became even more cautious, moving only under the cover of the deepest night. He taught Alara simple codes, a bird call to signal all clear, a specific arrangement of stones to mark a safe path. They slept in barns offered by sympathetic farmers, hidden in root cellars, or deep in the woods. Alara's pregnancy made every step an effort, but the thought of her child being born into slavery, or worse, being taken by Thorn, drove her forward. One freezing night, huddled under a rocky overhang as a sleet storm raged, Alara felt a sharp, rhythmic pain low in her belly. It wasn't the usual cramp. It was different, stronger, regular. Her breath caught. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I think the baby's coming." Jonah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm in the dim light. "Now? But we're weeks early." "I don't know. It hurts. Like waves." Another contraction seized her, stealing her breath. She doubled over, clutching her stomach. Panic warred with determination in Jonah's eyes. They were miles from the next safe house, in the middle of nowhere in a freezing storm. But there was no choice. "Okay," he said, his voice shifting into calm. decisive action. Okay, Alara, breathe. Like Mammy Ruth taught you, remember? In and out. He quickly gathered their blankets, creating a nest on the driest patch of ground under the overhang. He built a small, contained fire for warmth, his movements swift and sure despite the tremor in his hands. For hours, Alara labored in the cold, damp darkness, guided by Jonah's steady voice and the fragmented memories of Mammy Ruth's teachings. He held her hand, wiped her brow with a damp cloth, murmured words of encouragement. He was her rock, her midwife, her protector, all in one. The pain was immense, a force that threatened to consume her, but Jonah's presence anchored her. She focused on his gray eyes, on the fierce love and determination she saw there, not just for the child, but for her. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the sleet, a new sound pierced the air, a thin, angry wail. Jonah, his hands surprisingly gentle despite their roughness, held the tiny, squirming bundle. He quickly cleaned the baby with a corner of a blanket, his movements careful and reverent. "It's a girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't hide. He looked at Alara, his eyes shining with tears. "She's perfect, Alara. She's beautiful." He placed the tiny, warm bundle on Alara's chest. The baby, red-faced and furious from her sudden entry into the world, quieted almost instantly, rooting instinctively. Alara looked down at her daughter, at the shock of dark hair, the tiny fingers curling around her own. A wave of pure, overwhelming love crashed over her, so powerful it stole her breath. This was her child. Not Thorne's property, not a bastard, just hers, and Jonah's in the only way that truly mattered, through protection, through sacrifice, through love. "She needs a name," Jonah said softly, kneeling beside her, his hand gently stroking the baby's downy head. Alara looked at him, then back at her daughter. She thought of Clara, the sister Jonah had lost, whose suffering had set them on this path. She thought of the strength it took to survive, to fight, to hope. "Clara," she said, her voice firm. "Her name is Clara." Jonah's breath hitched. He looked at the baby, then at Alara, a profound understanding passing between them. He nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Clara," he repeated, the name a promise, a tribute, a new beginning. They stayed under the overhang for 2 days, letting Alara recover, letting little Clara grow stronger. Jonah hunted small game, kept the fire going, and watched over them with a vigilance that never wavered. He held Clara when Alara needed to rest, his large, calloused hands cradling her tiny form with infinite tenderness. The bond between them, forged in shared trauma and desperate flight, deepened into something unbreakable, centered now on this fragile new life. When Alara was strong enough to travel again, they pressed on, carrying little Clara in a sling against Alara's chest, wrapped in Martha's knitted blanket. The journey to the final safe house in Pennsylvania felt different now. They weren't just fleeing. They were carrying hope. They were carrying the future. The Miller farm was a picture of quiet prosperity, neat white fences, well-tended fields, a sturdy brick house with smoke curling from the chimney. The Quaker family, gentle-eyed Abigail and her quiet husband, Thomas, welcomed them without hesitation, their faces filled with compassion, not curiosity. They had a warm room ready, clean linens, and a fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time since Magnolia Grove, Alara felt truly safe. She could sleep without fear of being dragged from her bed. She could walk in the garden without looking over her shoulder. She could hold her daughter, Clara, and know that no one would ever tear her away. The Millers treated them not as fugitives, but as guests, as family. Abigail helped Alara care for the baby, sharing her knowledge of herbs and remedies. Her calm presence a balm to Alara's still frayed nerves. Jonah, however, remained watchful. He knew Thorne's reach was long, his vengeance relentless. He spent his days helping Thomas with the farm chores, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle always within easy reach. He spoke little of the future, but Alara saw the tension in his shoulders, The way his hand would sometimes drift to the pocket where he kept the bill of sale, the 12-cent receipt that was both a symbol of her degradation and the unlikely start of their journey. One evening, as they sat by the fire, little Clara sleeping peacefully in a cradle Abigail had provided, Jonah finally spoke of what lay ahead. "Canada," he said, his voice low. "It's the only place Thorn can't touch us. The Fugitive Slave Act doesn't reach there. We can be truly free." Alara looked at her daughter's peaceful face, then at Jonah. "Canada," she repeated. Felt like a dream, a place so far away it seemed mythical. But it was real, and it was their only guarantee. The Millers, through their network, arranged the final leg of the journey. A trusted conductor would meet them at a prearranged spot near Lake Erie in 2 weeks' time. A boat would take them across the water to freedom. Those 2 weeks were a strange mixture of peace and suspense. Alara cherished every moment with Clara, every quiet conversation with Jonah, every simple meal shared with the Millers. But the shadow of Thorn was always there, a constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface calm. They knew he wouldn't give up easily. The night before they were to leave for the lake, Alara couldn't sleep. She sat by the cradle, watching Clara sleep, her heart full of love and fear. Jonah found her there. He didn't speak, just sat beside her on the floor, his shoulder warm against hers. "Are you scared?" he asked softly, his eyes on Clara. "Yes," Alara admitted, "but less than before. Because of you. Because of her." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his rough ones. It was the first time she'd initiated such a touch. "Jonah, thank you. For everything. For buying me. For protecting us. For being here." Jonah turned his hand, squeezing hers gently. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I didn't just buy you, Alara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I found you, and I found her." He nodded towards Clara. "You're my family now, my reason, my home." He reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from Clara's forehead. "And I'd walk through hell itself to keep you both safe." In that quiet room, with the fire crackling and their daughter sleeping peacefully, the last walls between them crumbled. The shared trauma, the desperate flight, the birth of Clara, it had forged a bond deeper than ownership, deeper than obligation. It was love. Fierce, protective, hard-won love. The journey to Lake Erie was tense, every mile fraught with the fear of being spotted. But the conductor, a grizzled former slave named Samuel, was a master of evasion. He moved them through hidden paths, across fields under moonless skies, his knowledge of the land and the patrols impeccable. They reached the designated spot, a secluded cove on the vast, dark expanse of the lake, just before dawn. A small fishing boat was waiting, manned by 2 more members of the network. Samuel helped Alara and Clara aboard, then Jonah. The boat pushed off silently into the pre-dawn gloom. The water was choppy, the air cold and damp. Alara held Clara close, her eyes fixed on the dark shoreline of the United States receding behind them. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and pinks, they saw it, the distant shore of Canada. It was just a smudge on the horizon, but it represented everything. Freedom, safety, the future. Jonah stood at the bow of the boat, his arm around Alara's shoulders, his other hand resting protectively over Clara in her sling. He didn't speak, but the tension that had been his constant companion since Magnolia Grove finally, visibly, began to ease from his shoulders. He looked down at Alara, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "We made it," he whispered. Alara leaned into him, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. She looked at Clara, who was awake now, gazing with wide, curious eyes at the vast expanse of water and the rising sun. Her daughter, born free. Her daughter, named for the sister Jonah had lost, but carrying a future unburdened by the past. They stepped onto Canadian soil as the sun fully cleared the horizon, bathing the land in golden light. There were no fanfares, no crowds, just the quiet lapping of the waves and the vast, open sky. But for Alara, Jonah, and little Clara, It was the most profound moment of their lives. They were free. Years later, in a small house in a bustling Canadian town, Elara would tell Clara the story of her birth. Not the horror of Magnolia Grove, but the courage of the journey, the kindness of strangers, and the unwavering protection of the man who had bought her for 12 cents. She would tell her about Clara, the aunt she was named for, and the vow that had saved them all. Jonah never spoke of the 12 cents again. It was a relic of a life they had left behind, a cruel joke from a world that no longer held power over them. In their new life, Elara wasn't property. She was his wife. Clara wasn't a bastard child of a monster. She was their daughter, their joy, their future. And the 12 cents? It was just the price of a beginning, the unlikely, desperate spark that had ignited their fight for freedom, a fight they had won, together. The auction block was a distant nightmare, but the love forged in its shadow, and on the long road north, was their enduring reality. They were free, and they were finally truly home.